Okay, so a really brief introduction to John Stuart Mill, and talk a little bit about his inspiration, which was his inspiration, which is a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, and a little bit about utilitarianism generally, in order to help you, I think, see what it is that John Stuart Mill is doing in our reading. So I'm going to spend a lot less time in this introductory video on John Stuart Mill's life, but you can read about it online if you're interested. Born in 1806 and he died in 1873. What else? John Stuart Mill is a British philosopher, was incredibly influential in his day, probably the most influential and the most famous philosopher of the 19th century. He spent, for much of his life, he worked for the British East India Company. He was also a member of Parliament. Um, and like I said, incredibly influential, both in his own day and in our day as well. Mill's utilitarianism is a moral theory that is still defended by a number of important philosophers. And as you'll see, utilitarian thinking is probably more common than you might think. All right. So, consequentialism. Remember from our earlier discussion the distinction I made between consequentialism and deontology, and actually virtue ethics is the third kind of ethical theory. So, quick refresher, kinds of ethical theory. There are virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism. Virtue ethics, we saw that Aristotle is a version, Aristotelian ethics is a version of virtue ethics. Kantian ethics is a version of deontology. And John Stuart Mill, his utilitarianism is a version of consequentialism. So that was just review. So consequentialism is a kind of moral theory that distinguishes right from wrong based on the consequences. If the consequences are good, then the action is good. If the consequences are bad, then the action is bad. Kind of simple. So we get different kinds of consequentialist theories depending on how we understand good consequences. For example, ethical egoism is a moral theory that is consequentialist in form, but differs from other forms of consequentialism in that egoism defines good consequences as good for me, so that the right thing to do would be what is good for me, and the wrong thing to do would be what is bad for me. Clearly, it doesn't sound like a very moral theory, and as far as I know, no one seriously considers ethical egoism as a moral theory today. It's important to realize that utilitarianism is not ethical egoism. So many people get confused about this. It's not what is good for me, although what is good for me does count on the utilitarian from the utilitarian point of view. It's by far not the only thing. So, what does good mean for the utilitarians? So, by good, the utilitarian moral philosophers mean pleasure or happiness of everyone. Utilitarianism defines good consequences as the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the greatest amount of happiness for everyone involved, really everyone in society. So, if the consequences of an action, or the expected consequences of a contemplated action, are that it results in the greatest happiness for the greatest number, then it's the right thing to do. So Jeremy Bentham, 1748-1832, he was really the founder of utilitarianism. He was a friend of the Mill family. He was close friends with John Stuart Mill's father, and let's see, he was also highly influential in his day. Um, not so much in ours. Bentham's version of utilitarianism is largely discarded today, and John Stuart Mill's more nuanced version is the one that we study, and that some people still take very seriously. Bentham, on the other hand, is not really taken that seriously. He studied primarily for his influence on John Stuart Mill and the differences that John Stuart Mill makes in developing Bentham's version of utilitarianism. So here's Bentham, nice painting of him back in the day. And I don't know, I put this in there just for the heck of it because it's weird. This is Bentham today. When he died, he left instructions for his body to be mummified, and it was purchased by University College London and is on display. So you can actually go see old Bentham today. In fact, why am I showing you this? Because it's a mad, mad world. That's why. This is the University College London webpage where you can see Jeremy Bentham, and from all angles. Like I said, it's a mad, mad world. Actually, this isn't his head. His head got really gross, and so they took it out and put it in a safe. Also, University College London, no longer on display. This is a wax head. Anyway. So, crazy facts of his philosophical history. The mummified remains of Jeremy Bentham on display. Craziness. You don't have to know that, but whatever. So Bentham, founder of utilitarianism, had a very simplistic version of utilitarianism. Sometimes it's called act utilitarianism. He thought that you could quantify pleasure more or less exactly and order society in a way that maximized happiness or pleasure for everyone that was involved. He treated pleasures as though it was the same for everyone. And he also focused merely on quantity, or the intensity of pleasure. So, on this version, if we wanted to know what was right or wrong, we could just literally calculate pleasures and pains. It's a matter of a hedonic calculus, a matter of doing the math. So he called it a hedonic calculus. Hedone is Greek for pleasure, and calculus means calculating. So hedonic calculus is literally doing the math with respect to pleasures and pains and trying to maximize, as it were, pleasure and minimize pain in order to find out what the morally right thing to do is. Kind of a crazy idea. So, what to do? You see here, there's my cursor. Here's the trolley car, very famous conundrum in ethical theory. And there's a lot more to it than we are going to go into in this lecture. There's a trolley car coming down the hill. The brakes are out. This is you. You got the lever. It's going to run into these 5 people. Or you could pull the lever and it just whacks the one person. What is the right thing to do? Mill and Bentham would both appeal to the consequences in order to determine what the right thing to do is. Kant, as you know, would have a very different perspective on the trolley car example. But it seems clear that Bentham would say pull the lever. Do the math. Let's say, and this isn't the exact units that he would have given them, but for the sake of argument, let's say that life is worth 1,000 units of pleasure, then clearly not pulling the lever yields a net loss of 4,000 units of pleasure, right? There's 1,000 units of pleasure if this guy lives, 4,000 units of pleasure are preserved at the 5,000, right? Subtract that one because he dies, and then boom, you have a net gain of 4,000. So pulling the lever is the right thing to do because it yields the greatest amount of happiness. Again, it's the consequences that matter. Utilitarianism counsels weighing the negative and positive consequences of an action and choosing the action that results in the greatest amount of the positive consequence, where the positive consequence here means the net amount of pleasure or happiness. They're after the net amount of happiness or pleasure. Consider this case, what to do. One room in the hospital, there's a man dying from a head injury, but has a good heart. No way to save him, and he's definitely going to die in a few days. Maybe he'll linger on for a week or two. Yet, in the emergency room, there's someone else who needs a heart transplant, or they're going to die in hours. So you see the conundrum for the utilitarian? Could you kill and harvest the heart from the man with the head injury? Seems something that doesn't really, I think, jive with our moral intuitions to say that, but it's hard to say exactly why. If you take a moral theory class, you would go into these things a lot more detail. Here we're looking for the basic idea of how utilitarianism works and how it differs from Aristotle and Kant. So again, it's a survey course, so we're not going to get into details there. But what about experimenting on prisoners on death row? They're going to die anyway. What about the whole question of capital punishment, for that matter? Bentham and Mill were both against capital punishment. What about the atomic bomb? A bunch of people die, but so the theory goes, it saved millions from a protracted war in the Pacific. If that was the justification, was it still justified? Was the second one also justified in the same way? Again, I'm not telling you what the answer is here, but a utilitarian would approach these moral questions from this sort of detached view, right? Sort of like Spock. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? How far can the means ends reasoning here be taken? And this is one of the problems that's faced by utilitarianism, because it's really just the ends justify the means for the utilitarians, where the ends there are human happiness and relief of human suffering, right? That's the end or the goal. But it justifies any means. It seems problematic to many other non-utilitarian ethical theories. Does human happiness really justify any means? Or is there any amount of human happiness that would justify some actions, such as wanton murder? Part of us, I think, would like to say no. All right. So Mill's version of utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill modifies Bentham's version of utilitarianism in several ways. He drops the numbers game, at least literally, although it's still helpful to get an understanding of how utilitarianism works generally. Mill doesn't think that we can actually assign numbers to particular kinds of pains or particular kinds of pleasures and quantify them and literally do the math in a hedonic calculus. So he drops that aspect of Bentham's view. He also adds a distinction, very important distinction, between quality and quantity. He distinguishes between higher and lower pleasures. So with Mill, it's no longer just a matter of maximizing the greatest intensity or the greatest amount of pleasure, but it becomes important to preserve certain qualitatively superior pleasures, or qualitatively different pains as well. So generally, Mill gives a much more nuanced version of the basic utilitarian idea that was developed by Jeremy Bentham. Anyway, we'll have some occasion in the next set of lectures to take a closer look at Mill's version of utilitarianism. But I just wanted to, in this video, to give you some idea of the basic picture of utilitarianism, its foundations in the thought of Jeremy Bentham, so that when you start getting into the actual reading of John Stuart Mill's essay, Utilitarianism, which can be very challenging in this sort of very heavy 19th century prose, you have an idea of the basic structure of what he's dealing with. All right. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the next one.